For a long time, I believed the Grammy Awards were about one thing: musical excellence. The best record of the year wins. The most deserving artist gets recognized. And for a long time, I was wrong. The Grammys aren't decided by a small panel quietly weighing artistic merit. They're decided by a vote by the Recording Academy's membership. And like any voting body, popularity, visibility, history, and campaigning all play a role. Once an artist is nominated, they're actively out there advocating for votes. And at that point, it stops being a pure meritocracy. If you've ever watched an awards show and thought, how did that win over this? You're not alone. I've had that reaction more times than I can count, especially in the Jazz Grammys. So in this video, I'm going through each 2026 Jazz Grammy category, and I'm doing two things. First, I'll tell you who I think should win, based purely on musical excellence. Then, I'll tell you who I think will win, based on how the Grammys actually tend to vote. Sometimes, those two things line up. Often, they don't. That tension between excellence and popularity is what makes the Grammy Awards so frustrating. And honestly, kind of fascinating. As a working jazz musician who spends a lot of time listening to, playing, and thinking about this music, this stuff matters to me. So let's get into it. Let's start with Best Jazz Vocal Album, because this category perfectly illustrates the difference between musical excellence and Grammy behavior. And this split between excellence and recognition is something we're going to see again and again as we move through the categories. There are two albums here that to me clearly rise to the top, and they couldn't be more different. On one side, you've got Samara Joy's Portrait. Samara has become one of the Recording Academy's favorite jazz artists over the past few years, winning everything from Best New Artist to recent jazz categories. And honestly, I'm glad to see it. She's a legitimate singer, deeply rooted in the tradition, and she's become a real public face for jazz. On Portrait, the production is bigger than what we've heard from her before. Large arrangements, big band, strings, a very polished presentation. That's not always my favorite setting for vocal jazz because sometimes I think it can soften the swing a little bit. But here, it works. Her phrasing, time feel, and musicality are so strong that she carries the entire album effortlessly. It's a beautifully executed record. On the other side, you've got the Dee Dee Bridgewater and Bill Charlap collaboration, and this album is the complete opposite. It's sparse, it's raw, it's just voice and piano. The arrangements are unexpected, the performances feel risky, and there's this edge of your seat quality throughout. It's two masters at the absolute top of their craft, making something that's deeply rooted in tradition, but feels spontaneous and alive in real time. To me, that honesty, that vulnerability is a huge part of what jazz is about. If I'm choosing purely on artistic grounds, this is the one I'd give the award to. Dee Dee Bridgewater and Bill Charlap. Not because the Samara Joy album isn't excellent, it absolutely is, but because this record feels more intimate, more exposed, and more aligned with the aesthetic of jazz that I personally value most. That said, I'd be completely comfortable with either album winning. They're both outstanding. But if we're talking about how the Grammys actually tend to vote, I think it's pretty clear. Samara Joy is very likely to win Best Jazz Vocal Album for Portrait. She's highly visible. She has recent Grammy momentum, and she's become one of the Academy's most recognizable jazz artists. That combination matters a lot. And honestly, if that happens, I'm fine with it. It's a great album by an incredible musician. Now, if the vocal category is where tradition and presentation collide, Best Jazz Instrumental Album is where the Grammys' relationship with legacy really comes into focus. And this is where things get a little more complicated. This category is stacked, but it also raises an uncomfortable question. Who is this award actually for? Is it about recognizing the strongest record of the year or reinforcing jazz history that's already been well established? The two albums that really stand out to me are Branford Marsalis Quartet's Belonging and John Patitucci's Spiritfall. On Belonging, Branford Marsalis is revisiting Keith Jarrett's album of the same name. But this isn't a cover record in the traditional sense. It's a true reimagining. The band brings so much personality to this music, balancing deep respect for the original material with a strong sense of forward motion. The album feels like a conversation between the past and the future, rooted in tradition, but very much alive in the present. It's an outstanding release. Then there's Spiritfall by John Patitucci. And yes, you all know, I'm a big fan of John Patitucci. But beyond that, this is one of the more adventurous albums in this category. The instrumentation alone sets it apart. Bass, drums, and saxophone, with John moving between double bass and 6-string electric bass. It's not radical for the sake of being radical, but it does explore texture, space, and form in ways that feel intentional and modern. It's thoughtful, exploratory, and quietly bold. If I'm choosing based purely on artistic merit, I'd be happy to see either of these records recognized. Now, based on Grammy history, I think this category is very likely to go to Trilogy 3 from Chick Corea, Christian McBride, and Brian Blade. It's a live album. The performances are excellent, and all three musicians are giants. But I'll be honest, that's complicated for me. Chick Corea is one of my favorite musicians of all time, and his passing was a huge loss for the jazz community. He's already been recognized posthumously by the Grammys, and while I completely understand why this album would win, I can't help feeling conflicted. A Grammy is more than a trophy. It's fuel. It boosts visibility, careers, and opportunities. And part of me wishes that recognition would go to musicians who are still with us, creating new work right now. We'll see where this lands. And what's interesting is that this exact same pattern shows up even more clearly once we move to large ensemble records. The same elements are still in play here: name recognition, institutional comfort, and a preference for projects that feel familiar to voters. This category is all over the map, from genuinely ambitious large ensemble writing to records that feel more like novelty or throwback projects. And that contrast tells us a lot about how the Grammys approach big band jazz. There are several excellent albums here. Lumen by Danilo Perez with the Belusian Big Band is beautifully written and deeply thoughtful. The Kenny Wheeler Legacy Project is intelligent, nuanced, and emotionally rich. Music that really demands careful listening. Both of these records feel serious, modern, and forward-thinking. But for me, the album that rises to the top is Without Further Ado, Volume 1 by the Christian McBride Big Band. The performances are top-notch across the board. The writing is strong, the band sounds incredible, and McBride's ability to bridge straight-ahead jazz with broader stylistic influences comes through clearly. Yes, it leans a bit more traditional and at times a bit more accessible, but it never feels watered down. It feels confident, joyful, and fully committed. Based purely on the strength of the record, Without Further Ado Volume 1 gets my vote. It may not be the most experimental album in the category, but it's executed at an extremely high level, and it understands exactly what a large ensemble record needs to be. And in this case, I think the answer to who will win is the same. Christian McBride Big Band is very likely to win Best Large Ensemble Album. Christian McBride is one of the most respected and recognizable figures in jazz today, and he's consistently been favored by the Recording Academy when he releases work at this level. This is one of those rare categories where artistic excellence and Grammy behavior actually line up. After large ensemble, Latin jazz is where the conversation naturally opens up beyond one tradition. The category brings in multiple cultural lineages, different rhythmic languages, and very different ideas of what jazz can be, which makes it one of the more interesting jazz categories at the Grammys. What I like about this category is that it doesn't point in just one direction. There's a real range here. Deep tradition, forward-looking writing, and multiple cultural perspectives. And honestly, this is one category where I'd be okay with several different outcomes. Across the nominees, you hear very different approaches to Latin jazz. There's music here that's deeply rooted in dance traditions, music that leans towards modern large ensemble writing, and music that blends multiple cultural influences in subtle ways. That variety is part of what makes this category work, even if the Grammys don't always articulate why one approach wins over another. One record that I want to point out is Paquito de Rivera's album. Paquito was born and raised in Cuba, but throughout his career he's been an advocate for a much broader range of Caribbean and South American musical traditions. You really hear that on this record. It's beautifully played, deeply informed, and full of joy. If I'm choosing based on artistic impact and depth, the album I'd give this award to is Mangduagua, celebrating Carla Bley by Arturo O'Farrill and the Afro-Latin Jazz Orchestra. Arturo O'Farrill has done enormous work advancing Latin jazz, but what makes this record special is the connection. He began his career working with Carla Bley, and he knows her music from the inside out. This doesn't feel like a surface-level tribute. It feels personal, thoughtful, and forward-looking, honoring the past while actively reshaping it. The balance is powerful, and it really comes through the music. In terms of Grammy behavior, this category feels like a toss-up between Paquito de Rivera and Arturo O'Farrill. Both are well-known, highly respected, and familiar to the Recording Academy. If the award does go to Arturo O'Farrill, I think that it's actually more likely to go to the other nominated album from the Afro-Latin Jazz Orchestra, the one that leans more heavily into recognizable traditions and dance-oriented material. That kind of record tends to align more closely with what voters expect when they see the words Latin jazz on the ballot. And honestly, that would still be a perfectly deserving win. This is one of the stronger categories, top to bottom. So far, a lot of this comes down to how the Grammys define categories, and that becomes impossible to ignore in the next one, Best Jazz Performance. This category is meant to recognize an outstanding jazz performance, vocal or instrumental, but the way it's defined actually tells us a lot how the Grammys think about jazz. This category breaks down in a very different way than the album categories we've talked about so far. Rather than rewarding a specific solo moment or performance concept, this category simply lists tracks without clearly defining what aspect of the performance is being honored. That lack of definition isn't a problem with jazz. It's a window into how loosely the Grammys sometimes frame their jazz categories. Still, the award exists, so the question becomes which performances best represent where jazz is right now. The track I'd like to see recognized here is Noble Rise by Lakeisha Benjamin featuring Emmanuel Wilkins and Mark Whitfield. This pick is slightly outside my usual lane. It leans into groove, brings in subtle Latin and funk influences, and prioritizes feel alongside virtuosity. But that's exactly why it stands out. The arrangement is strong, the writing is thoughtful, and the alto playing from both Lakeisha Benjamin and Emmanuel Wilkins is outstanding. More importantly, this performance feels current. These are younger musicians actively shaping the present and future of jazz. And that matters because a Grammy isn't just about acknowledging quality, it's also about visibility and momentum. Based on Grammy behavior, this category feels split between two very familiar outcomes. On one side, there's Windows Live by Chick Corea, Christian McBride, and Brian Blade. Legendary names, impeccable musicianship, and a performance that voters instantly recognize. On the other, Peace of Mind, Dreams Come True by Samara Joy, another artist with significant recent Grammy momentum. Both performances are excellent, but if either of these wins, I'll admit I'll feel conflicted. Not because they're undeserving, but because recognition here could mean so much more for artists who are still building their trajectory. I'd love to see this award help push Lakeisha Benjamin and musicians like Emmanuel Wilkins one step further forward. We'll see how it plays out. If Best Jazz Performance shows how loosely the Grammys define excellence, Best Contemporary Instrumental Album shows how loosely they define contemporary. This category has existed for years, and it still raises the same question. Contemporary compared to what? Because in practice, contemporary here doesn't mean experimental, forward-looking, or even especially modern. It usually means instrumental music that's accessible, commercially adjacent, or familiar to a broad audience. That's not a value judgment, but it is something we should name. This is where a lot of music lands when it doesn't fit neatly into traditional jazz categories, but still feels safe to voters. Interestingly, truly boundary-pushing jazz fusion often doesn't end up here. So what we get is a category that's less about innovation and more about market positioning. Once you understand that, the nominees make a lot more sense. The album I'd most like to see recognized here is Beat Trio, Bela Fleck, Edmar Castaneda, and Antonio Sanchez. This record doesn't sound like it belongs in this category, and that's actually part of why it stands out. Banjo, harp, and drum kit is an unusual combination, but in the hands of these three musicians, it becomes something remarkably cohesive. The rhythmic ideas are complex, the writing is thoughtful, and the music is both challenging and deeply accessible. It's not contemporary in a marketing sense. It's contemporary in the sense that it sounds like something that could only exist right now. That's the kind of record I'd like to see rewarded. But based on Grammy behavior, this category tends to favor familiar names and long-standing careers. Because of that, I think the most likely winner is Just Us by Bob James and Dave Koz. Both are veterans of the smooth jazz world. Both have strong name recognition, and both have a long history with the Grammys. That combination matters here. A possible dark horse would be Gerald Clayton's Ones and Twos, especially given his rising profile. But if I had to put money on it, I'd expect this category to go to Bob James and Dave Koz. That's not a knock on the record. It's simply how this category tends to operate. If Best Contemporary Instrumental Album is loosely defined, Best Alternative Jazz Album is where the Grammys' uncertainty about jazz becomes impossible to ignore. This category raises a simple but uncomfortable question. What does alternative jazz even mean? Because the way it's used here doesn't describe a sound, a method, or a tradition. It describes a marketing problem. My read is that this category exists to house music that draws heavily from hip-hop or popular styles, gets marketed as jazz, and doesn't fit comfortably into traditional jazz categories. That framing is messy, but it does one important thing. It keeps these records from displacing more traditional or experimental jazz records elsewhere. So while I have issues with the label, I understand why the category exists. The album I think should win here is Honey from a Winter Stone by Ambrosch Achiemscher. This record surprised me. It ended up on my best of the year list, and it's not the kind of album I usually spend a lot of time with. Yes, there's spoken word and rap on the record, but it's not framed in a conventional hip-hop way. Large portions of the album are sparse, dissonant, rhythmically skewed, and genuinely exploratory. What makes it work is context. The hip-hop elements feel integrated, not pasted on. The album draws equally from jazz tradition, minimalism, and contemporary black music. And it holds all of that together in a way that feels organic and intentional. This is experimentation with purpose. It's challenging, honest, and deeply musical. That's what I'd like to see recognized. As a runner-up, Blues Blood by Emmanuel Wilkins is also worth mentioning. A strong record by a young artist with a lot to say. But my pick here is Ambrosch Achiemscher. Based on Grammy behavior, I think this category is very likely to go to Keys to the City, Volume 1 by Robert Glasper. Robert Glasper has become one of the most recognizable names associated with modern jazz adjacent music. He's worked extensively in hip-hop and popular music. He's won Grammys before, and voters know exactly who he is. That visibility matters, especially in a category this vaguely defined. Would I love to see Ambrosch Achiemscher win this award? Absolutely. But if I'm predicting how the Grammys tend to operate, this feels like a Robert Glasper category. So those are my picks across the jazz categories at this year's Grammy Awards. Who I think should win based on musical excellence, and who I think will win based on how the Grammys tend to operate. I'm going to keep score. I'll put my picks together and share them over on Patreon. And once the Grammys are over, I'll come back with a follow-up video to see where I was right, where I was wrong, and what we can actually learn from the results. More than anything, though, I want to hear what you think. Tell me where you agree. Tell me where you disagree. Which records do you think deserve recognition? And which picks do you think the Grammys are actually going to make? That tension between excellence and popularity is what makes the Grammy Awards so frustrating and still worth paying attention to. I have a lot of thoughts about how this could work better, but that's probably a conversation for another video. We're only a few weeks away from the ceremony on February 1st, so we'll find out soon enough. No matter how frustrating the system can be, the music itself is still worth paying attention to. Thanks for spending some time with me, and I'll see you in the next one.